Hey everyone, Steven here, and welcome to my little library of horrors. Well, sorry for no video last week, everyone. My daughter unfortunately came home from school with the flu, which then spread out through my entire house, and everybody got sick. So I just genuinely didn't have the energy or the free time to sit and record a video. It was just too chaotic with everything going on. You know, I sat there and was like, I just had a root canal, I've now got the flu, there's this going on, there's this going on. Is there a full moon this week or something? And, well, there wasn't a full moon. I was thankful that while a couple of little small inconveniences happened that would make me think of a full moon, I'm glad that it did not drive me into a bloody rampage, much like the main character in our book review today, Goodnight Moom by Jack MacLane. So, after reading my last book, The Ceremonies, and which I enjoyed, it was definitely a slow burn, a little heavy, and I wanted something more fast-paced and fun. I was looking for something that screamed B-horror, and this is a book that I have been meaning to get to ever since I got it into my collection, which I got this actually from my good friend Harry over at Harry's Books of Horror. I'll leave a link to his channel down in the description below. But, everything about this book just screams absurd. From the cover, to the title, to the synopsis on the back of it. Everything about the book just screams B-horror. And that's exactly what I wanted. But as I got into the story and it started to unfold, I was genuinely really surprised with how deep the messaging within the book itself was. And I think, to me, that's another case of an author that knows how to grab an audience by putting out something that gets your attention in order for them to see what the actual message within is. The synopsis of the book talks about this child that was locked away in a basement who finally escapes and kills people driven by some urge of the moon. So, as I said, you're expecting some kind of slasher B-horror cheesy goodness, and that's what I wanted. But as I said, what unfolded within this book genuinely was surprising to me, and I was blown away at how attached to the characters I was. So yeah, the beginning of the book starts off with pretty heavily, to be totally honest. We're introduced to Ed Leach and Harriet. I can't remember her last name because this is before they're married. But that's our first characters we're introduced to, is Harriet and Ed. We'll just call them the Leaches since they do get married. But anyway, Harriet's this sort of, naive younger girl at the time who has this idea of, the hopeless romantic in life and everything. While Ed is your very typical angry, grumpy, typical 80s boomer, essentially, and it starts off, they get married, and Ed didn't want to get married. He clearly doesn't really have any emotional attachment to her. He just pretty much ended up getting her pregnant and now had to get her married. But their first night on their honeymoon, he openly slaps her, and it's pretty shocking. And then essentially forces himself on her. So it's very heavy beginning of the book, which after a couple years we're then introduced to our next character, who is I can't even say our antagonist, because I don't see him that way, but I will break that down further into the review. But then we get introduced to Harry Leach, who is the Leach's son that gets born. And, Harriet's very, very helicopter momish, but Ed is very, very much the emotionally absent, physically abusive, emotionally abusive father that is he believes, I'm the one that works, you're the wife, you have to take care of the child. I'm simply here to provide for the child. I'm not here to build a relationship with my son. And so one day, Harriet ends up getting incredibly sick and is not able to change Harry, which then Ed reluctantly does so, which Harry ends up peeing on Ed, which causes Ed to throw Harry against the wall. And so, like I said, the intro is incredibly brutal and intense. It's very difficult. Essentially, Harry ends up getting brain damaged. And as he starts to grow as a boy, they start to notice things are a little off about Harry, and not so much the sense that he is obviously brain damaged and can't talk. Harry starts to bud into essentially what a serial killer would be. There's this very, very graphic scene where he's torturing a cat that is probably one of the most intense animal torture scenes I've read. Like, it wasn't graphic, like it doesn't describe everything he's doing. It's more so the aftermath that you're just like, holy cow. And, Ed's way of dealing with this is by beating Harry, and his beatings are incredibly violent. I don't even really want to get into detail just because it's pretty graphic, but essentially all throughout Harry's life, that's what he's come to know is violence. That's all he knows is being hit and talked down to and everything. So, we start to see this connection with his own obsession with violence in itself. He goes from a cat to a dog to a cow, and then we end up getting this very, like, I guess uncomfortable, but not in the sense where it's like, why would somebody sit there and think about writing this? It's an uncomfortableness that lets your imagination wander, where, as Harry gets enrolled to school, he sort of befriends this young girl that's really nice to Harry, while other kids, while they don't necessarily pick on him, they avoid him because they feel that something's off about him. But like I said, except for this one girl that he befriends, who then ends up going missing. And, so that essentially causes Ed to lock Harry in the basement. He builds essentially a cell for Harry in the basement of the house, and they lock Harry away. They convince the school that, the special needs school that the principal originally suggested for Harry to go to, he's now going there. His parents have convinced the principal that Harry's just going there now, so nobody questions where he is. And this leads to a 10-year imprisonment for Harry, where he essentially, like I said, is locked in a cell in the basement for 10 years with barely a window, just a bed, and I think probably like a 10 by 10 space, essentially. So as the decade goes by and Harry grows, he essentially grows into this huge man. He's now, I think, 17 or 18 at this point, and has grown into a very physically intimidating man, much like Ed is. That's a thing with Ed, is that's his personality. That's like a big trait about him, is he's very intimidating and physically dominant, not just by, asserting that, but just in presence alone. And that's something Harry has also inherited, is his physical dominance just by appearance. And so one day, as Harry's mother goes down to feed Harry, Harry ends up killing her and escapes the cell. So now this is where the story really starts to unfold, as Harry, having not seen any of the world in the past 10 years, is now out and about in the town, guided by the moon, who he calls Moom, and, because he doesn't know how to talk. So as he's exploring, Ed comes back to see that Harry's escaped. And with Ed, it's not so much the fact that he's going to go to jail for having Harry imprisoned. He doesn't want to be seen as a man that has failed his family, is not able to take care of his own problems. So that turns into now Ed going on a manhunt for Harry. He's decided, I have to kill Harry now. This is what it's got to be. So Ed calls up a couple buddies from the bar, which brings in our next set of characters, Leo and Jack. Which, to me, this is where the book goes from being sort of this B horror into a genuine story. Because instead of having, Harry, we have this, mindless, essential Michael Myers-esque character. That's the best way I can describe Harry, is he's very Michael Myers in his presence. Again, very physically dominant, doesn't speak. So, we have these characters that it's not necessarily that we don't have a bond with them. It's just, Harriet was very meek and Ed's a terrible person. So, there's nobody to root for right now until we get introduced to Jack, so Leo is essentially your typical country bumpkin, is, Ed's lackey, follows him around, does what he says, where Jack, is not necessarily a flunky of Ed's, but his sort of personal arc is he is secretly a gay man, and, he lives on his own, he has no family where he is, and he doesn't want this secret getting out. So, he sticks with Ed and Leo to sort of build up this, facade of being a straight man, essentially. But therein lies where Jack sort of becomes our quasi-protagonist. You know what I mean? He's the one that is sort of iffy about the whole thing, about going on this manhunt to find these so-called killers. Ed lies to them and says a group of killers broke into his house, killed his wife, and da-da-da-da-da. So Jack's very hesitant about this. We get into this backstory about how he went on this hunting trip with his father, and, it traumatized him. He couldn't kill the animal, and that effectively molded his personality throughout his childhood. So, like I said, that's where Jack sort of becomes our protagonist and someone we can cheer for. We want Jack to survive the night because, as I said, he's someone that isn't so gung-ho and isn't a terrible person overall. So, as that happens, we now get introduced to yet another set of characters with Sherm and Mary Jo. They're essentially kind of like our cannon fodder for Harry. So, we get the scene where Sherm and Mary Jo are, just making love in their trailer and things like that. And that's when Harry stumbles onto the trailer. And that's where really our first good action scene comes in, because Harry breaks into the trailer and is destroying the place, because the author does a good job of putting us inside Harry's mindset. He's not... From the outside world, Harry is this mindless brute that's destroying things and is killing people. But within Harry, he's learning the world. He has no idea what's going on. To him, noise is exciting. And he has this fascination with, like I said, with violence, because that's what he grew to know. Violence is okay. That's how you express yourself, is through being violent. So he goes into the trailer and we get this scene where he knocks out Sherm and ends up murdering Mary Jo. Sherm escapes and Harry leaves the trailer following Moom. And So Sherm goes to the local bar, grabs a couple of his buddies, and they go off to hunt for Harry. While, again, Ed and Jack and Leo are also following Harry's trail. They come across the scene in the trailer, and, again, more stuff happens where I don't want to spoil it too much. So, essentially, the scene builds up to the third part of the book. We get to about a third of the book where we get introduced to our final duo of characters, George and his grandfather. And this is really where the book picks up even more. The pacing throughout the book is really, really good. The author does... The nice thing is he's not so focused on heavy metaphors and building this nice prose. It's very simple prose, but each chapter lingers on, okay, I have to know what happens next. And that's... And it's just that pacing's throughout the whole book. Like, every scene builds and builds and builds and builds. And every chapter ends on this wonderful cliffhanger of, okay, something bad's going to happen. I have to see what happens. So, being introduced to new characters so far into the book was a little jarring for me, to be honest. But, lo and behold, they ended up being my favorite characters in the book. George is this 10-year-old boy who lives with his grandfather in a cabin in the woods, essentially. They're poor. They don't have much, but, they're very wholesome characters. And, it now adds this really awesome element to the story where George's grandfather tells him the story of Bloody Bones, a folk tale of essentially a local woodsman that has gone crazy, stalks the woods, and hunts people by the light of the moon. He carries a knife and is a cannibal that stalks the woods and hunts people. So it now adds this nice extra story element to the story within the story, essentially. So now we bring... so what happens is George's grandfather unfortunately dies from an illness, leaving George alone in the woods. And, this is after remembering the tale of Bloody Bones. And as George leaves, opens the door to the cabin to go to the bathroom, who does he see walking down the trail other than Bloody Bones, a.k.a. Harry? So this is like the crescendo, not even the crescendo. This is where the climax starts, is where Harry spots George in the cabin and absolute all hell breaks loose. It's this awesome cat and mouse scene of Harry chasing George through the cabin. The cabin catches fire, again, I can't give too much detail because it's so exciting, just how everything goes. As this is all going on, Sherm's group ends up bumping into Ed's group. And this is where we start to see Ed's personality come to full circle, where throughout the book, he sort of balances... We get into Ed's mindset of why he is the way he is. It's because that's how his father raised him, with beatings and things like that. And with Ed, he essentially normalized his trauma. He said, I turned out totally fine, didn't I? That's how my dad raised me, and I turned out fine. There's something wrong with Harry, not me. There's something wrong with him that I can't fix. So, but we also get this balance, this sort of juggling act within his mind of, did I do enough? Am I doing the right thing? But that's when we get to where Ed meets this group, who he makes the connection, must be from the trailer that Harry essentially ransacked. So Ed has this flashback of when he was in high school going on this hunting trip with a buddy of his, and he had this urge to kill his friend, to just, not out of anything he did or anything, but it was just a thought that crossed his mind. I could do this and nobody would know. And so that thought now proceeds into the present day, and Ed opens fire on Sherm's group of friends. So Ed has now become full-fledged psychotic and is now, I can kill anybody I want and I can get away with this. This is who I am. Which I think is a really good moment within the climax, because it now not blurs the line, but solidifies the line, the difference between Ed and Harry. Is Ed is doing this out of joy, while Harry gets joy out of doing it, but is because he doesn't know any better, where Ed clearly knows what he is doing is wrong, but doesn't care. Harry does it not knowing the difference between right and wrong in this situation. He doesn't understand the concept of death. So, Sherm ends up escaping while his friend's up getting shot. And, they all followed the light of the fire. Sherm, Ed. And that's where we end up getting to the crescendo of the climax, where everyone ends up coming together. Ed finally runs into Harry, George, and Sherm. They're all in this group. And it's just this really intense scene, because Ed is holding George and Sherm captive while Harry is sitting there cowering from Ed. Like, as powerful as Harry is, that we see throughout the book, he's still terrified of Ed, because he's connected that thing in his brain where Ed's voice leads to pain. So Ed is holding Sherm and George hostage, and, is essentially like, you know what? If you guys can walk past Harry without him killing you, I'll let you go. So it adds this really intense scene. And we essentially get to the climax, which leads to the ending, which the ending is, it's great. It's how the story needed to end, but it's by no means a feel-good ending at all. It's very, very heartbreaking, to be totally honest. But it was good. It was great. It was the ending that needed to happen, and wrapped up the story really nicely. So yeah, overall, I absolutely loved the story. I thought it was fantastic. It was fast-paced, lots of action, with some really emotional moments, and a lot of moments that made you think. With Harry starting off as, obviously the sympathetic killer, he sort of evolves from this mindless brute in our minds to essentially just this lost child still, who was doomed from the start. Harry had absolutely no chance in life at all from birth. Like, he was doomed to fail in life by no means of his own. It was the generational trauma he suffered. And I think it was really, I just find that really interesting that, someone that's killing people, we can still have sympathy for. It's something that really fascinates me within horror, is building sympathy with characters that we're naturally inclined to despise. And I think that's really difficult to do, especially when you have an not an antagonist, excuse me. I don't see Harry as an antagonist. When you have a character that's openly killing people and sort of reveling in it. But like I said, it's not, at least to me, like, I don't hate Harry for it. He genuinely doesn't know any better about it. He is, the only thing that connects in his mind, but other than the violence, is the moon. The moon has been his only solace throughout his life while he was locked away in a cage. And, his mother would sing to him a song about the moon. And that would be sort of the drive he needed to keep going is, moon is good and so is violence. So, yeah, so I think it was overall a really fantastic book. What would I rate it? Honestly, 6 out of 5 for me. This was a book that after I turned the last page, I really wanted to go back to page 1 and read it again. I genuinely could have sat and read this a second time right after I finished it. It like I said, going into it, you don't have really any high expectations. But as you start to dive into the characters and the psychology behind everything, you start to build this bond with everyone inside. And you actually do start to cheer for people and want to see people live. So, to me, that's just a sign of a really talented writer and a fantastic story overall. So yeah, absolutely 6 out of 5 on this one. What's the overall takeaway I get? Well, in times of tragedy, I think we all want answers. I think it's easy to point at the person who's doing these awful things and saying, they're an awful person, they deserve the death penalty, they deserve to spend the rest of their life in prison. And while in some cases, yeah, that's absolutely true, that's not the case in every scenario. There's things behind those people's minds that have led them to this breaking point, and oftentimes that is generational trauma. So I think we should all take sort of an introspective look at ourselves in recognizing generational trauma within ourselves and learning to heal from that and not passing it on to other people around us, especially as us as parents. I do my best to break generational trauma of my own. I love my parents and everything. They did everything for me, but my parents were very emotionally absent, I guess. They weren't saying I love you and giving hugs and things like that was not big in my family growing up. So, I make it a point now to tell my kids every day that I love them. And, I do hug them and I give them a kiss goodnight every night. My son's 10 years old. I still give him a big kiss goodnight and I still tell him I love him, because it was something I craved as a child and didn't really realize it. And I don't want that for them. So I do my best to break my own generational trauma. But yeah, that's going to be it for me today, everyone. Thank you all so much for watching. If you've made it this far, I really appreciate it. If you haven't made it this far, I still appreciate you giving me a little bit of your time. If you want to check out some more of my reviews, I'll leave a playlist in the description below, along with a playlist of my book hauls and some other videos on general horror history if you're interested. But until next time, everyone, be nice to yourselves. Until then, later.